of the Naperville League of Women Voters Summer Election Series. I'm Melanie Greenberg from the National Council of Jewish Women. We are pleased to join forces with the DuPage County NAACP and the Naperville League of Women Voters for this important and informative series. We have over 200 registered attendees tonight. Just a few housekeeping notes. This webinar will be recorded. All attendees, other than the panelists, will have their video and audio muted. Thank you for submitting your questions in advance. The National Council of Jewish Women is a grassroots organization of volunteers and advocates who don't need to be either Jewish or women. We turn progressive ideas into action. Inspired by Jewish values, NCW strives for social justice by safeguarding individual rights and freedoms. As a national organization made up of over 100,000 advocates around the country, we are outraged and devastated by the murder of George Floyd. It is both unacceptable and exhausting that in 2020, we still need to insist over and over again, Black Lives Matter. This program is of particular interest to me as the Illinois co-chair of NCJW's Promote the Vote, Protect the Vote campaign. We are working hard to ensure that every eligible voter is able to register to vote at all levels in a deep and meaningful way. I am now pleased to introduce Michael Childress, President of the DuPage County NAACP.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone. My name is Michael Childress, and I have the pleasure and awesome responsibility of serving as the president of the DuPage County NAACP. Our association is the largest and oldest civil rights organization in the world. The NAACP has more than 2,200 branches and over 500,000 members worldwide. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People is recognized as a non-governmental organization by the United Nations. The NAACP's historical records has been housed at the Library of Congress, which serves as the organization's official repository since 1964. The NAACP has and will continue to fiercely demand equal and complete access to the ballot box in every community in every state, and our North Star will always be civil rights and social justice. With that said, it is our hope that you get all your questions answered tonight and then vote like your life depends on it. The struggle continues, and now let's get to those questions. And now Jeff.
Thank you. On behalf of the League of Women Voters of Naperville, welcome to our second webinar in this summer election series. Our partners in tonight's programming are the National Council of Jewish Women and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. In our first webinar, we heard from the Public Information Officer of the Illinois Board of Elections on what will be different about the fall 2020 election process, specifically voting by mail. Tonight's program focuses on the legislative initiatives being sought to make our elections open and being conducted with the utmost integrity. Our three organizations have always promoted the idea of open and free elections as a part of democracy. Because of the current epidemic racing across our country, plans need to be made to modify the traditional voting roles. This means everyone needs to be aware of those changes so that their vote can be counted in the fall. Tonight's webinar, entitled, "What Will Our November 2020 Elections Look Like?" I am Jeff Knezovich, Treasurer of the League of Women Voters of Naperville. I will conduct the questioning of our state elected officials. The League of Women Voters encourages the informed and active participants of citizens in government and works to influence public policy through education and advocacy. Any citizen 16 years of age or older, male or female, may join the organization. The League of Women Voters is nonpartisan and neither supports nor opposes candidates for elected office, but does act on issues after member study and have a consensus. The League of Women Voters has a long standing of advocating for open elections and the abolishment of any restrictions that may restrain any registered voter from proper access to the election process and to the polling places. This has been the mainstay of the League since the suffrage movement, and the right for women to vote was granted on August 18, 1920, 100 years ago almost. Tonight's format will include 2 question and answer sessions focused on topics of fair and open elections. The first question and answers will be directed to state elected officials, then to our federal representatives. We are pleased to have with us State Senator Laura Ellman, whose district represents Naperville and many of the surrounding communities. Senator Ellman currently serves on a number of the committees, including higher education, agriculture, government, accountability and pension, and Veterans Affairs. She is also vice chairman of the Energy and Public Utilities Committee. Our second presenter is State Senator Julie A. Morrison. Senator Morrison is the chair of the Human Services Committee as well as the Special Needs Caucus, a bipartisan group committed to advocating for the needs of Illinois residents with disabilities. She also sits on public health, agriculture, environment, and conservation, and transportation committees, and will serve as a member of the Council of State Government Midwest Legislative Conference Health and Human Services Committee. Morrison continues to fight to make our state government more transparent and accountable to the citizens of Illinois. She passed a law that places term limits on Senate leadership positions and is working with nonpartisan groups who are trying to end political gerrymandering so that Illinois can get to choose our representatives, not the other way around. Senator Morrison's district represents the North Shore communities. Both Ellman and Morrison are great advocates for election renewal and access for all. Let's get right into the questions, if I may. This is for Senator Morrison. We learned in our last webinar that on November 2020 election is going to take place. It will happen. What do you think needs to be done between now and then to ensure that the voting public has an open and especially safe election process?
Mr. Moderator, thanks for asking me to be here this evening and join my colleague, Senator Ellman. Great timing, because just yesterday, Governor Pritzker signed 2 election bills that will actually reform what our election is going to look like in November 2020. I was the chief sponsor of both those pieces of legislation. Vote by mail, an expansion of that for Illinois is going to be critically important, not just for people who are more concerned about their health or elderly, but across the board. COVID-19 has threatened people, and there is a lot of concern about what it's going to be like in October and November. Right now, we're opening up into phase 3 and soon phase 4, but it wouldn't be a total shock surprise. This legislation greatly expands vote by mail. It provides that anyone who voted since 2018 in an election will automatically receive an application for a ballot. There are many different pieces to this legislation. I'm happy to talk about all of them, but
well, let's get to that process. You said 2018, I automatically will get an application. That might be 43% of the Illinois voters. What do the other 47% do?
They are going to be able to continue the very same pattern that we've had. If they choose to vote in person, we have actually expanded the hours for in-person voting. We have enhanced that situation as well by opening up our election judge pool to younger members of our community. Actually, you only need to be 16 years old now and trained to become an election judge. We think this is a smart thing, you know, to engage young people and hopefully have them continue to be active of the system. But we lost a lot of election judges in this cycle or so because there was just concern about becoming exposed to COVID-19. You know, I think we know a lot of our valued election judges are retired folks because they actually that whole day and do the 16 hours that's necessary. So that's an important part of it.
I have I'll have another question for Senator Ellman. This comes from one of your constituents. Now that the legislative package bill 18633 has been signed by the governor yesterday, are we going to have an election process in the state of Illinois that's going to be different? Will it make the process easier or more complicated for the voter? What I am asking, should we expect long lines and a reduction in polling places? P.S. I like it as a state holiday, but it should be a federal holiday.
Those are some great questions. Thank you, Jeff. Before I answer that, I wanted to, and as part of the answer to this question, I wanted to add something to Senator Morrison's comments. In addition to those automatic applications that are going to be mailed to all of the voters from the 2018 elections and beyond, there will be greater access to apply for a mail-in vote, a mail-in ballot online as well. So people can go to the State Board of Elections website and initiate that vote by mail application from there too.
Would they be able to do it through their county website, county clerk's website?
Yes, and that's already available. In fact, I was just checking on it, and if you go to your county board of elections, and they have a form to fill out so that you can initiate that process.
Perfect. All right, back to the question. You think it's going to be easier or harder in the fall?
Well, you know, we are trying to do our best to make it easy given the state of the pandemic. I think a lot of people are concerned about their health and staying socially distant. And so this particular bill, Senate Bill 1863, addresses some key parts. And that is obviously expanding vote by mail. It's very easy to stay safe when you're voting from home. In addition, as Senator Morrison mentioned, early voting is a means for reducing those voting day lines. You'll have lesser crowds when you're voting early voting, and those hours are going to be expanded so those crowds can be more thinned out.
Senator Ellman, what about, we just saw examples of this in Georgia, the long lines during the primary down there, because people complain they didn't get the ballot that they requested. How are we assuring the electorate in the state of Illinois, if you apply for a ballot, you're going to get it?
Yeah.
That goes to both of you.
Yeah, the State Board of Elections and each county, they've got the same set of deadlines. And if I recall correctly, and please, Senator Morrison, if I'm wrong, correct me, but people can apply for a ballot as late as October 1st so that they can get their ballot by October 6th. And they'll able to do that through one means. And then, so they should be able to get those ballots in plenty of time.
And you can actually, if you would like to, since the bill's been signed into law, you could actually go online now and apply.
Excellent.
It's effective. So we've actually backed that up from, I think it was an August 5th start or August 3rd start. We've actually backed it up several weeks. So there's even more time to apply. I know that there are lots of organizations, maybe such as the League and others who are participating tonight, that are going to help us with the educational piece of this.
Mm-hmm.
That's a really important part. Whenever you change voting behavior, And this is a change, an addition, an enhancement. It's important to make sure that the voters know what their rights are and know what the process is going to be. So that's going to be probably the very first most important thing that we begin this summer.
And those ballots will be postage paid, so the general public does not have to worry about getting those back to the Board of Elections?
No, they will not. When we started this process, when I began working on this bill, I had hopes that everything would be paid, that we would be able to pay for the postage of the application, if you did it on paper, and the ballot being mailed back and forth. That just didn't happen. This part of the compromise is that the voter is still going to be responsible for putting the stamp on. But I will tell you, if you read the language of the bill, that no ballot will be returned or rejected for lack of postage. So if you do drop your ballot into the mail without a stamp or not the right denomination of a stamp, it will make its way through the Postal Service and it will be delivered to your election authority.
Do we expect that ballot to be one first-class stamp?
I'm not sure. I think that would make things a lot easier.
Makes sense if we can make that happen.
Hope so.
One of the other questions that has come over the wire is legislative access to elections. We know that there's been a push in some states to make elections, let's use the word, more difficult to access. What is Illinois doing from the legislative arena to make sure that all the minorities, anybody who wants to vote, has access to the polls, and assuring that we're not going to be eliminating polling places? Laura, you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I do. All polling places are going to, well, with the coronavirus and the pandemic, there are a lot of polling locations that are hesitant to allow people to come to vote, namely senior centers and schools. And in anticipation of that, the CARES Act actually has provided, as part of their funding, grants so that election commissions can actually rent locations so that there will be adequate places to vote.
Now, with this being a state holiday, are schools going to be closed on the state holiday?
Schools will be closed, yes, but they still may be hesitant to allow strangers and
access into the buildings because of the virus, understand.
Right.
So people should be very aware that their polling place in the fall might be moved.
Yeah, and that's another big piece of voter education. There's a lot of changes that are possible and probable during this election. And
let's identify what some of those changes might be. Senator Morrison,
sure.
What's one of the top one or two things that might change?
We'll have, we're going to have younger election judges. When your ballot is mailed in, and let's talk about that piece because that's where a big change is. Right now, when you mail your ballot into your election authority, it's generally an employee of the county clerk, of their office, that will receive and open and process your ballot. Now, it's not counted then, but it is opened and processed. And if your signature is missing, if there is something that doesn't look right, if there is going to be a challenge to your ballot's perfection, then it's one person who's actually doing that work now. This legislation, this bill, expands that. Now, when the ballots are received in the election authority's office, a team of 3 election judges, regular election judges like you will see at your polling place on election day, will be performing that function. So there is greater integrity. There are 3 sets of eyes looking at this ballot that is coming in, and these are not employees of the county. These are election judges who have been trained and recommended most likely by their parties. And this will, and it requires that it be a bipartisan split of those 3 individuals.
Okay. Anything else that the general public should be aware of going into this year's election that might look different to them?
Well, go ahead, sorry.
You know, and part of this CARES funding is also funding to clean the school afterwards, or the facility. So the election authority can then have cleaning done professionally, and that is something that they can apply for funding. They can apply to recoup that funding through the State Board of Elections. We also are going to be following Department of Public Health guidelines in terms of wearing masks, gloves, all the new hygiene that we have been learning the last few months will be in play, and that should give people a little greater sense of security. And hopefully the lines will be much shorter. We're really hoping to have at least 50% of all the voters cast their ballot through the mail.
Senator Morrison, will we know that the workers will be masked and possibly wearing gloves during their job performance. Would anybody be turned away from a polling place if they weren't wearing a mask?
You're asking me a question I don't have an answer to. And I would guess that will be left to the jurisdiction of that local election authority.
Okay. Senator Ellman, we got a question that came across the wire here about fraud. It's anticipated that there'll be a rise in fraudulent casting of ballots due to the mail-in system. Is this justified?
Well, there have been studies on fraud in voting, and there have just not been very many instances of that. And there are a lot of states, Oregon, for example, comes to mind, that have been doing, and Colorado, who have been doing vote by mail for a very long time. And the number and percentage of fraudulent ballots cast are just not there. However, there are, as Senator Morrison described, there are ways of checking when a ballot is returned to make sure that that signature is intact. There's really, remember, a 2-step process. First of all, the registration is checked before the ballot is mailed out. And then once the ballot is received, it is checked again. So there are safeguards in place, and there just hasn't been a lot of instances of fraudulent ballots cast.
Senator Morrison, one of your constituents asked, if I think I may have spoiled my ballot, can I go in and vote in person on the day of the election?
So we already have that in place, because that occasionally does happen, people that vote by mail. If you do send your ballot in, it's opened, let's say, and you forgot, let me give you a couple scenarios, and you forgot to sign it, for example, and they're able, there's a 48-hour window that the election authority has to contact you, either by email, by phone, to give you the opportunity to cure that ballot.
Oh, okay.
So, and that's, I think that happens sometimes now, but that's written into law because it's just an extra step. It's an extra piece of security, so people know that if they did forget to do something, they're not going to have wasted their ballot. But if I change my mind and I go in, it would be, I believe, and I bet you have experts listening on the call that are going to correct me if I'm wrong, that obviously only one ballot is going to be counted, and the first ballot, I believe, would be the one that is counted.
Okay. In a situation like this, with all the mail-in ballots anticipated now, will we have results on election night? Are we going to wait several days to find out what the state of Illinois has done?
Well, we may have a delayed, we may have a delay in having winners declared if it's a very close election. One of the things that is prescribed in the statute is that as these waves of ballots are coming in to the county clerk, they are instructed to gather their pools of 3 election judges to begin processing them as you go. There's no reason that a county clerk should wait until the last couple days when they know there will be an onslaught. That if this is done gradually and they are opened and verified and processed, we're hoping that it won't be a great delay there, but it's very possible there will be some delay.
Senator Ellman, one part of the legislation is directing county officials to be prepared for the voter by mail. Are all the counties going to be fully funded to get this process up and running?
Well, there is 16.8 million extra dollars through the CARES Act to cover such expenses, and that's done through that Illinois has applied for a grant for those, and that will cover. Let me just give you a kind of a laundry list of the things that could cover for a local election board. Voting by mail tabulation, staffing, supplies, poll locations for rent, as I mentioned before, machine testing and vendor support, PPE, voter education, even local voter education, and even poll worker salaries if necessary. So those kinds of expenses are all available through that CARES Act funding that can help make sure that those elections are safe and smooth.
In the legislation, Senator Morrison, is there a mandate that X number of voting places still be open? We've seen in some of the recent primary elections that they've been consolidating polling places. And we've heard that that's been a hardship for many people to get to other locations because it used to be on their bus route. Has our legislation guaranteed that the counties will have the same number of polling places?
It leaves that decision and that authority with the local election authority. And I think let's go back to the idea that schools are now available. You're right, in some communities where public transportation is so critical and so important, there have been the loss of polling places, making it really difficult for people to find and get to their polling place. We're hoping that by opening up schools, those are community centers that are accessible and that, you know, we hope will just lend itself to this whole program. There are 4.9 million people, we estimate, give or take, that are going to receive this first application. That's how many voters we're going to be looking at as with the first touch. Anyone who registered to vote after the March primary this year will automatically be on that list and will automatically be receiving an application for a ballot as well.
Oh, excellent, excellent, good. We now need to shift our program over to the federal side, but I do want to thank both the senators for their time, their knowledge, and their participation. I know you're all busy people. So let me turn this over to Michael Childress, who's going to handle the questions for our U.S. representatives. Michael?
Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate it. I'm going to jump right in. And the first question will go to Bill Foster, Congressman Foster. What is the status of the Klobuchar-Wyden bill, the Natural Disaster and Emergency Ballot Act?
Oh, right. Let me think for a while. Well, first off, I just want to really applaud Senators Klobuchar-Wyden for introducing this bill. I think it is up to over 30 co-sponsors, including Senators Durbin and Duckworth, so you don't have to lean on them. But Among other things, it would ensure voters have 20 days of early voting in all states, and also ensure that all voters have the option to request absentee ballots. You know, this won't have a big effect in Illinois, but it will have a huge effect in other states where there's not nearly the same enthusiasm for getting, for seeing every voter vote. And just as with the HEROES Act that was passed in the House, this is a common sense bill that recognizes the need to make voting more accessible this November so that, you know, people aren't risking their lives or their families' lives in order to exercise the most important right we have in our democracy. Interestingly, polls show that most Americans support measures like voting by mail by massive margins. Simply to keep everyone safe to stop the spread of the virus. Even if they're intending to vote themselves, they know people who are elderly or have medical conditions that would really be unhappy at being forced to go to a polling location to exercise their right. So now, you know, what we have to do is convince the leadership in the Senate to bring this up for a vote, get it passed, and get it, you know, something that the House can merge with.
Okay, thank you. The next question goes to Congressman Casten. After witnessing the Georgia primaries, what will it take to get federal election standards throughout the country?
You know, so the answer is we just need to really pass what we've done in the House. And, you know, and I realize this is a nonpartisan event, but when we passed HR 1, which creates a whole set of nationalized, you know, federal standards, and I should say HR 4, which addresses some of the pre-clearance issues to restore Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. We passed those a long time ago. We're waiting for the Senate to bring it up, but when we passed HR 1, which among other things would provide this federal oversight of elections, Mr. McConnell said that this was a Democratic power grab. And he may have meant that with a capital D. I took it with a lowercase d because it's true. If everybody can vote, it's a power grab for democracy. Now, as it sits right now, a lot of those rules are done at the state level. And as Congressman Foster pointed out, we are fortunate to live in a state like Illinois that has had for a long time a commitment to making sure that everybody can vote. But there are states like Georgia that we've seen. There's, you know, you look at the lines that happened in Wisconsin. And, you know, I think the answer for this cycle is going to be, we are going to continue to count on the kindness and support and all the great work that the League and the NAACP have done to make sure that people can vote, so that maybe in the 117th Congress, we can make sure that these bills that we've passed on the House floor actually become law.
All right, thank you. Next question goes to Congressman Foster. The secretaries of state have tremendous power over elections, and either purposely or through incompetence can literally throw elections. The first question is, should there be federal legislation to hold them accountable?
Well, it depends on exactly what they do. I mean, there are situations where, you know, there's overseeing elections that they are a participant in, which seems like it's an outrage that should just never be possible in a real democracy. You know, there are, I think, minimum standards that we have to have for access to polling locations. You know, people should not be forced to wait in line for 5 hours under any circumstances to exercise a right to vote, and especially not in a public health emergency like we're going through. And, you know, from time to time, there will be problems. And I don't think if you've made a good faith effort to conduct an election and you have, you know, for example, technical difficulties with equipment or something like that, you know, that I don't think, you know, you should throw them in jail for this. But I think that you really have to, you have to have, I think, national standards. That's, you know, not, that wasn't the thinking of our founding fathers. They thought just leave it up to the states. And the problem is, you know, and part of that calculation was that there were states that were not enthusiastic about giving everyone the power of the polling booth. And so because of that, you know, most advanced democracies have national standards for for elections, and I think it's past time that we join them.
Okay. And then I'm going to follow up with another question is that should there be federal legislation to require all secretaries of state to recuse themselves from the elections that they're running in?
I think it's obvious. You know, the fact that it's, you know, our system works with an assumption of you know, good faith and fair play. And it's one of the things that maybe it was always, there were always outrages in politics and I just wasn't aware of them. But if you look at the sort of things that happen in states like Wisconsin, you know, I grew up in Wisconsin and I do not recognize the behavior of the people who have the power, so that, you know, when say they lose an election and then the legislature immediately strips the power of the office that they just lost. You know, this sort of thing where you just, you know, it's just disappointing. But rather than to let those outrages continue at the local level, I think we just have to, you know, have federal laws to that mandate elements of fair play.
If I could just quickly chime in on that, Michael, HR 1, I believe, does expressly prohibit secretaries of state or anybody from getting involved in an election where they are on the ballot. So that would federalize and protect against the situation that Stacey Abrams found herself in Georgia in the last cycle. And maybe just to amplify what Congressman Foster said, I think a part of this also comes down to who we vote for, because there is no way to create a world where that which is ethical is a lower bar than that which is legal, right? What's ethical is always going to be a standard north of what's legal. And unfortunately, what's legal is always going to be a standard north of what's cost effectively prosecutable. And when we elect people who are down at that lower level, we put our democracy at risk. You know, when you sit here and say, did the Russians interfere in the last election? Did people who were running for office conspire with them to cause that to happen? Did they fraudulently elect the election? You send a message to the voters that if we're not going to hold ourselves accountable, why should you obey the laws that were? You know, this whole consent to be governed thing starts to fall apart if people say, well, what's good for me is not good for thee, right? And so you know, should we legislate to ban these things? Yeah, but if we don't elect people who hold themselves to a higher ethical standard, we can't always play catch up on the law.
Okay. And I'll go back to you. Can you kind of elaborate on that HR 1 bill? Is there anything else in there that?
Well, let's see. It's got sort of a laundry list of things. It required automatic voter registration, online voter registration, so you can go online to get registered. The expansion of early voting, simplified absentee voting. And greater oversight of the election vendors. These are the people that make the equipment. There have been some very serious questions raised about some of the computerized election equipment. And finally, you know, I know this is near and dear to the heart of the League of Women Voters, the establishment of independent redistricting commissions, so that you wouldn't have gerrymandering, you'd have fair maps.
And public financing of elections.
Yep.
I mean, I like an HR 1 to saying, like, you know, every time the NFL goes on strike, you always know how it's going to end. They're going to put a rookie wage cap in place because it's really easy to make concessions for the people who aren't at the table. The HR 1, I think, in many ways is the bravest thing that Congress ever passed, because incumbency is a powerful tool. And if you create fair election maps, if you create public financing of elections, if you give everybody the right to vote, you substantially take away the power of incumbency. And you give that power to democracy.
Okay. Do you see, and this is for either of you, both of you, do you foresee any circumstances that the election could be postponed or canceled due to C-19 or any other circumstances?
Nope.
Yeah, well, I don't know, a global thermonuclear war. I think, you know, it certainly would, you'd have to, you know, get around the Constitution, federal law, actually. So that I don't think, you know, who was it? I think it was the son-in-law of the president, who shall not be named, you know, went in front of some microphone not long ago and said, well, you know, maybe we'll decide we might want to move it. I don't know. It's not his choice. You know, this would happen only if both the Senate and the House and the president, you know, came together and passed legislation to change the date.
Okay. What would it take to change the date? I've heard a lot of talk about the fact that it's pretty close to winter time. Maybe not this election, but at some point, would it make sense to move it to a warm weather type of date than November, the first week in November?
Well, the Constitution fixes the day at which there's the transition of power.
Mm-hmm.
You know, right now, you know, we have a very interesting situation of 2 months long, roughly 2 months long, when a president or a Congress, you know, at least some of the members of Congress and potentially president, you know, has lost an election and yet is still in power for 2 months. And that generates very interesting dynamics where the presidents are, even if you're just normally leaving at the end of 8 years, the presidents often try to get a lot of stuff done that they would never even talk about prior to their last election. So, you know, if I were to move dates, I would move it to narrow that window so that the lame duck session is shorter myself.
What's your thoughts on that, Sean?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'd echo what Bill said. I mean, I think to come back to the first point that Congressman Foster said, for the date to be moved, you need to have the legislative and executive branch agree to change the laws of the United States. So it really becomes to my mind, more of a political question of under what circumstance would there be a bicameral, bipartisan, two-branch agreement that this is something that should be politically done. And I don't think winter weather is going to be the thing that's going to drive that. You know, this will be my first term going into the lame duck, but you know, certainly there are already a lot of people sitting there talking about what happens in this administration in a lame duck. Are there going to be a lot of pardons coming through? You know, you essentially have no accountability if you're on your way out in that period because the voters have already held you accountable. So I would be very surprised. It's hard for me to contemplate a situation where that would be permanently changed. I hope we don't have thermonuclear war, but I can, but I think one can imagine circumstances where, you know, there is political will to make a temporary change, but it's hard for me to see that in this.
Yeah, no, if the British came in and burned Washington again, as they did in the War of 1812, you know, you can imagine, you know, some situations, but it's a pretty high threshold, and that's, you know, all three branches of government agreeing that there's a reason to do it.
Okay.
Yeah, I also just want to say, Mike, I mean, in the moment we're in, and you know, you alluded to this in the last panel, there's a legitimate issue to be concerned about in this upcoming election, which is that we're going to enter the fall. If we don't have a vaccine, if we don't have treatments, we're getting back to cold and flu season. We need to think about what it means to safely vote in that moment. And it's why the HEROES Act that we passed has money to make sure that everybody has a ballot at least 2 weeks in advance, that polling places are open for at least 2 weeks in advance, 14 days that they're open with appropriate social distancing, money to educate voters on all that sort of stuff. If we don't do that, you can certainly imagine a scenario as we get close to the election where people working with the agenda of disenfranchising voters might start telling people it's not safe to vote. And they would be right if the Senate fails to do what we did in the HEROES Act. But we have seen that coming, and we have moved in the House to make sure that we have measures to protect against that. We need to make sure it gets through the Senate. We need to make sure the president signs it. But we need to be a little bit sensitive, saying, well, let's move this around because there's some exceptional circumstance we didn't think about. We've thought all about this. We've done what needs to be done. We've just got to get the Senate to take it up.
Yeah, I think the issues of the climate will get less relevant as the whole country moves to voting by mail. You know, once people have voted by mail, they have very little interest statistically in going back and voting in person. And if you look at the polling on voting by mail, and particularly younger people are very enthusiastic about voting by mail. So I think it will be one of those issues like gay rights, where if you look at the demographics of the polling, you can just see this wave moving through. And that you can be fairly confident that if we don't get vote by mail in this election cycle, within a very short span of years, basically all of the people objecting to this will have died off, and then that'll be the end of the discussion, sort of like gay rights.
With the talk of the voting by mail, that leads me to my next question. Is the Postal Service, I know there's been some talk about trying to kill off the Postal Service, the post offices. Are we fully funded and ready to go with this influx of vote by mail? Will we be able to handle it?
So we gave in the CARES Act, I think we put about I want to say it was $10 billion to the Postal Service, which is less than they need. One of the things that really holds the Postal Service back, it doesn't get talked about enough, is that the Postal Service is, I think, the only entity in the country that is required to fully fund their pension obligations. Not fund so that as long as they hit a certain return, they'll be covered. They have to fully fund it. That was created in the George W. Bush administration. And so it creates a situation where the Postal Service is under significant cash constraints, in large part for accounting reasons. We've been pushing to get that changed. It's a long, boring story why it hasn't been changed yet. But it creates a circumstance where we need to continue to make sure that we shore up the Postal Service, especially as we get to a world where, the challenge with the Postal Service is that it costs the same amount for me to send a package from my house to Glen Ellen as it does for me to send the same weight package from my house to Anchorage, Alaska. Essentially the Postal Service that was set up, we had a Postal Service before we had a Constitution, right? And the idea was that everybody's going to be able to communicate this, but it is by design full of cross subsidies. And so as the Amazons and UPSs and FedEx have come in, they haven't taken over the rural routes. They've taken over the high margin urban routes and then outsourced to the post office the balance. So the design of the system has created this arbitrage opportunity. We, again, in the HEROES Act, provided a significant, and I'll get the number wrong, I think it's $3 billion. Bill, correct me if you think I've got that number wrong.
Yeah, I don't recall. Yeah.
But to shore up and make sure that the Postal Service is all covered. And I'm hard pressed to believe that going into an election, that the other side of the aisle or the president would say, you know what I want to do is to really alienate rural America right now. So I think there's a fair amount of political posturing that will ultimately be resolved. But it's sort of tragic because in the meantime, you got all these postal workers who have been deemed essential workers who are out there every day making sure that our packages come through. And we've injected far more uncertainty in their lives than they need to have. So I think it will get resolved, but not in as clean and proactive a way as we should have done it. You agree with that, Bill? Or
yeah, well, I think the odds that the Republican Party will let the post office go out of business are zero. The post office, I used to represent a largely rural district. And the post office was the one arm of government that was well loved. I remember I represented Dixon, Illinois, Ronald Reagan's hometown, and and one of the things I did was to rename the post office for Ronald Reagan, and the whole town came out. It was like, I don't know, something out of the 1950s, just wonderful. They just loved the idea of their post office, first off. And because it's one of the anchors, at a time when rural America is under a lot of stress, it's an anchor they can depend on, that the Postal Service will always be there. And if that gets, torn apart by a deliberate act of Congress, there are going to be a lot of scalps being called for. And the scalps that exist in rural America are mostly Republicans. So I just, I'm not at all worried politically that we won't find a way to keep the post office up and running. Also, the amount of mail traffic that is necessary to conduct election is a small fraction of the mail service that happens every day. Just think of how much junk mail you get in the Christmas season. You know, it's 5 things minimum in your mailbox like every day. The post office is capable of doing that. To conduct an election, you need a handful of mail transactions going back and forth per person over the course of 2 weeks. So this is not, the post office will notice it, but it won't be the worst thing that they've ever faced by a long margin. Probably much bigger will be the amount of campaign mail that they have to deliver.
Well, that leads me to another question. The Postal Service can handle it, and I'm pretty comfortable with that as long as we don't play around with the Postal Service. Do we have the manpower to count all of the ballots that are mailed in?
We do. So within the HEROES Act, the expanded election funding, and I think I mentioned before, includes all the resources to make sure that the states have that. So it's the vote by mail, it's the postage paid return envelope that's there. Now, what the governor has done in Illinois is fantastic, because he's just agreed to that, a lot of that here. But it's also providing the manpower to oversee that election. Having a longer polling period, in-person polling period with social distancing means you need more election judges, right? Because you're going to need more physical space, more time for people to be there. It means you need more education on the front end. You need to make sure, as we're changing the rules for when you can vote, that we've got folks out there watching for fraud and making sure that nobody's misrepresenting or taking advantage of this moment. And we spend time with a lot of experts working up to that $3.8 billion number that was in there. One point that I do just want to mention, particularly because it's so close to what the league and the NAACP do. When we put that budget together, it implicitly contemplated that we were going to get all of this done far enough in advance of the election to be able to go out and get the resources for voter education, that there's a new process. You may have a new polling station, there's vote by mail, here's how it all goes and looks like. To the extent that this becomes a political football that gets kicked back around for a while, I think we're gonna need to rely a lot on folks like you doing your good work to get people educated, because it's one thing to educate people when you got 4 months to get used to a new system. It's another thing when you've only got 15 days to get used to a new system, right? So I would say make sure, review those provisions of the HEROES Act, be up to speed on them, anything you can do to get folks educated on what that looks like, so that when it does come out, people are prepared.
Thank you. I have one final question, and either one of you or both of you can take it. This question is near and dear to the NAACP's heart. What can we finally do to get Shelby versus Holder reversed?
HR 4.
And HR 4, for the people that don't know what it is,
So HR 4, and I forget the title, I think it was the Voting Rights Restoration Act. The decision on Shelby versus Holder basically threw out Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And don't get the year exactly right, but essentially the court's argument was that because the pre-clearance requirement for states that said you have to be, certain states based on practices they had, Bill, I don't know if you remember the year, it was pre-1975 or something like that.
Yeah.
Those states that had practices that were actively suppressing vote prior to that year, they had to be pre-cleared before they changed any practices. What the court ruled in Shelby versus Holder was that the world's changed a lot since that year, and it needs to go forward. So what HR 4 did, it's a big complicated bill, but the key point is said, we're going to change this pre-clearance so that it's essentially a rolling, I think it's a 10-year look back. So the court's argument is essentially solved legislatively by saying, if you have a practice of doing this, and oh, by the way, look at when Shelby versus Holder was undone. A lot of those states that were subject to pre-clearance all of a sudden started violating exactly the same rules they were doing back in 1975. Well, if you pass HR 4, now you come back in and say, oh, oops, you just did it again. So the 10-year clock's going to start until you're ready to be, sit at the big boy table again.
Yeah, and the other thing, if I were to write it, and I think a lot of members of Congress, we just have this done in every state. The idea that there's only a limited number of states that bad things happen in elections, that's just not true. And so I think the office that is responsible for the pre-clearance is tiny. I think it's like 3 or 5 people that handles the I don't know, 5 states or whatever the number is that's subject to pre-clearance. You could have a very reasonable sized group of federal officials whose job it is to make sure every election in the country is conducted in a fair way, and that if someone makes a change to a polling location, you have to run it by the feds. And, very quickly, everyone would understand the rules, and a lot of the abusive things, would go away. I think, I've always felt a little bit queasy about treating any state different than any other state. And I think anyway, that's just, I'm not saying that that's what we're going to pass. Probably what we'll do is go back to the previous system. But I think that it's worth thinking about, just saying that, when we give a uniform federal responsibility to oversee elections, just treat all the states identically.
I really want to take the time to thank you for spending your evening with us and getting our questions answered. It's been very enlightening, especially from the standpoint of the NAACP. And at this point, I'm out of questions. We've gotten them all answered. I'm going to turn it back over to Jeff.
Thank you, Michael. And I want to thank all our presenters this evening for their insight and good discussion. I also want to acknowledge that invitations were extended to other legislators to participate in tonight's panel, but due to their schedules, they were not available for tonight's webinar. The League of Women Voters of Naperville want to thank the National Council of Jewish Women and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People for their programming assistance. And you, the viewer, for your involvement in this exercise in democracy. The third webinar in this series will take place July 15th at 7 p.m. Our guests for that program are the county clerks for both DuPage and Will County. We'll be focusing on local issues for the election. If your questions were not answered this evening, I know our presenters would be pleased to hear from you. In fact, we encourage you to contact your individual representatives to hear what they have to say about this issue. Visit their website for their contact information. Finally, we would like you as a member of our organizations. Membership information and applications are available online in each of our websites. Again, thanks to everyone for your participation in democracy, and have a good evening.